I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The moment we discovered that Julie was pregnant with an animatronic baby was one that shattered every notion of reality I had ever held. It started off like any other pregnancy discovery. Julie had missed her period, and after weeks of nausea and fatigue, she took a home pregnancy test. When she told me it was positive, I remember feeling a rush of emotions, excitement, fear, the whole spectrum that comes with the thought of becoming a parent. We had always talked about kids, but we never imagined it would happen like this. At first, everything seemed normal. We scheduled a doctor's appointment, did the usual blood work, and even started daydreaming about what life would be like as parents. But then, strange things started happening. Julie would lie in bed, and I would place my hand on her belly, expecting to feel the gentle flutter of a baby kicking. But instead of the soft movements of a growing child, I felt something off. It was a stiff, mechanical sensation, almost like gears turning just beneath her skin. It wasn't every time, but when it happened, it was unmistakable, a faint ticking, almost like the sound of a clock hidden under layers of flesh. At first, we tried to rationalize it, convincing ourselves that it was just our nerves playing tricks on us. Maybe it was normal, a quirk of pregnancy we just weren't aware of. But the feeling persisted, and the ticking became more frequent, more pronounced. Julie started to notice it too, the way her belly seemed to stiffen unnaturally at odd times, the faint vibrations that would ripple through her body. It was like something was moving inside her, something not quite alive. Our anxiety grew, and when we finally went in for the ultrasound, there was a tension in the air that neither of us could shake. We didn't talk about our fears, didn't voice the growing unease that hung between us, but it was there, unspoken but undeniable. The ultrasound technician was cheerful at first, chatting with us as she prepared the machine. But as soon as the image appeared on the screen, her demeanor changed. Her smile faltered, and the room grew deathly quiet. Julie squeezed my hand, her eyes wide with fear as we both stared at the screen. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The shape on the monitor was blurry, distorted, but as the technician adjusted the image, it began to come into focus. And what we saw was impossible. There, in the darkness of Julie's womb, was a figure that didn't belong, a small, rigid form that was too angular, too metallic to be a human baby. I could make out the distinct lines of joints, the faint glint of something shiny and hard where flesh and bone should have been. It looked like a doll, or a tiny machine, with tiny limbs that seemed to twitch ever so slightly, as if powered by some unseen force. The technician's face had gone pale, her hands trembling as she moved the probe over Julie's belly, trying to get a clearer view. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face said it all. She had no idea what she was looking at either. The room was filled with the soft hum of the ultrasound machine, the rhythmic beeping of Julie's heart monitor, and that strange, faint ticking sound that seemed to come from the screen itself. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. Babies were supposed to be soft, warm, alive. They weren't supposed to be this. My heart pounded in my chest, my grip on Julie's hand tightening as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Julie's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. The technician shook her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't know," she said, her voice shaky. "I've never seen anything like this before." The doctor was called in, and as he studied the ultrasound, his expression grew more and more grim. He asked us a series of questions. Had we been exposed to any radiation? Any unusual chemicals? Had there been any complications during conception? We answered them all, but none of it made any sense. This wasn't a birth defect, wasn't something that could be explained away by medical science. The doctor ordered more tests, MRIs, blood work, anything that might give us some answers. But with each new test, the truth became clearer. What was growing inside Julie wasn't human. It wasn't alive, not in the way we understood life. It was mechanical, artificial, a creature made of metal and wires rather than flesh and blood. The following days were a blur of confusion, disbelief, and fear. We met with specialists, trying to understand how this could have happened, what it meant. But no one had any answers. We were told that Julie was healthy, that the baby, if you could even call it that, was developing normally, but beyond that, there was nothing anyone could do. It was uncharted territory, a situation no one had ever encountered before. The doctors advised us to consider terminating the pregnancy, citing the unknown risks to Julie's health and the potential dangers of bringing such a creature into the world. But Julie refused. She was scared, just as much as I was, but she was also determined. This was our baby, she said, no matter what it was made of. We would figure it out, together. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. Part of me was terrified of what was growing inside Julie, of what it meant for our future, for our lives. But another part of me couldn't help but feel a strange sense of responsibility, even attachment. This was our child, our creation, in a way that went beyond anything I had ever imagined. And as much as I feared it, I couldn't just walk away. As the weeks passed, the truth settled in: we were going to be parents, but not in the way we had ever expected. The future was uncertain, filled with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear: whatever was coming, we were in it together. And no matter how strange, how terrifying, we would face it as a family. The lake appeared beside my house without warning, almost as if it had materialized overnight. One day, it was just a small puddle of rusted bolts and scrap metal, nothing more than an eyesore on the edge of my property. But within a few weeks, it began to grow, expanding in size and depth until it became a full-fledged lake, its murky waters choked with debris and remnants of forgotten machinery. It was an unnatural sight, a patch of industrial decay in the middle of the otherwise pristine countryside. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was strange, sure, but there was no immediate cause for alarm. I figured it was some kind of sinkhole or maybe the result of an underground spring. But as the days passed and the lake continued to grow, I started to feel uneasy. There was something about it that felt wrong, something that set my nerves on edge every time I looked at it. It wasn't long after the lake appeared that we found the VHS tapes. Julie, Marcus, and I had been going through some old boxes in the attic, looking for anything we might have missed when I moved in. That's when we stumbled upon them, a stack of old, waterlogged VHS tapes, tucked away in the corner of a dusty box. The labels were faded and illegible, and the tapes themselves were in terrible condition, covered in mold and grime. But there was something about them that drew us in, a strange compulsion to see what was on them. We found an old VCR and hooked it up in the living room, and that's when things started to get weird. The first tape was nothing but static at first, the screen flickering and distorting as the VCR struggled to read the damaged film. But then, slowly, an image began to emerge, a grainy, distorted view of an underwater landscape, filled with all kinds of sunken machinery and wreckage. It was like looking into a mechanical graveyard, a place where the relics of the past had been forgotten and left to rot. There were ships, cars, even old amusement park rides, all half buried in the muck, their surfaces covered in algae and rust. But what really caught our attention was the strange figure that appeared on the screen, moving slowly through the water. It was an animatronic Viking mouse, of all things, like something you'd see at an old, defunct theme park. But it wasn't just sitting there, decayed and broken, it was moving, roaming around as if it were still operational, even though it was clearly damaged beyond repair. We watched in stunned silence as the Viking mouse wandered through the underwater wasteland, its movements jerky and unnatural, its eyes glowing faintly in the murky water. It was corroded, parts of its metal frame exposed where the fur and fabric had worn away. But what was even more unsettling was the way it seemed to be searching for something, as if it had a purpose, a mission that it was determined to complete. The next tape was more of the same, more footage of that strange underwater world, more images of sunken machinery and forgotten relics. But this time, there were other figures, other animatronic creatures moving through the water, all in various states of decay. Some of them were almost unrecognizable, their forms twisted and distorted by years of submersion, but they all had the same eerie, lifelike movements, as if they were still somehow alive. We watched tape after tape, each one more disturbing than the last. The images were haunting, the kind that stayed with you long after you turned off the TV. But what was even more unsettling was the feeling that these tapes were connected to the lake outside, that somehow the lake had brought these things to life, had given them a second chance to move, to search, to hunt. As the lake continued to grow, my unease turned to fear. It wasn't just the sight of it that bothered me, though that was unsettling enough. It was the sense that something was alive in there, something that didn't belong. The lake had become a dark, ominous presence on my property, a source of dread that hung over everything like a storm cloud waiting to break. I began to notice strange things happening around the house. Objects would go missing, only to turn up later in places where I was sure I hadn't left them. At night, I would hear odd noises coming from the direction of the lake, clanking, whirring sounds that echoed across the water, like the sound of machinery coming to life. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing to worry about, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew stronger with each passing day. Julie and Marcus noticed it too. Whenever they came over, they couldn't help but glance nervously at the lake, as if expecting to see something rise out of the water. We tried to keep our distance, but the lake was impossible to ignore. It was always there, a dark, brooding presence that seemed to grow more menacing with each passing day. Then, one night, something happened that I still can't fully explain. I woke up to the sound of something moving inside the house, a soft, metallic clinking that sent a jolt of fear through me. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to find the source of the noise. The sound led me to the living room, where the VCR was still set up, the tape scattered on the floor. The TV was on, flickering with static, and the tape inside the VCR was playing, though I hadn't turned it on. I watched in horror as the image on the screen came into focus. It was the Viking Mouse again, but this time, it wasn't underwater. It was standing on the shore of the lake, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, its metal limbs twitching as it stared directly into the camera. Then, without warning, the screen went black, the tape clicking to a stop as the VCR ejected it. The room was plunged into silence, but the fear that gripped me was deafening. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fight something that shouldn't even exist. The lake had become a source of our greatest fears, a place where reality seemed to bend and break under the weight of something otherworldly. And as it continued to grow, swallowing more and more of my property, I knew that whatever was lurking beneath its surface was getting closer, inching its way toward us. It wasn't just a lake, it was a portal, a gateway to something dark and malevolent, something that had taken root in our world and was slowly, methodically, coming for us. And no matter how much I wanted to believe that we could escape it, deep down, I knew that the lake had claimed us the moment it appeared. As Julie's pregnancy progressed, the reality of what was growing inside her began to weigh heavily on both of us. What should have been a time of joy and anticipation was instead overshadowed by fear, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. The knowledge that our child wasn't human, that it was something else entirely, cast a dark cloud over our lives, one that we couldn't escape no matter how hard we tried. In the early days, after the shocking discovery that the baby was animatronic, we went through a period of denial. We clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, the doctors were wrong, that the ultrasound had been a mistake, or that there was some explanation that would make everything normal again. But as the weeks turned into months, it became impossible to ignore the truth. Julie's belly grew, just like any other pregnant woman's, but there were differences that couldn't be overlooked. The movement inside her wasn't the gentle kicking and shifting of a living baby, it was mechanical, stiff, and unnatural. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would hear it ticking and whirring, the sounds muffled by the layers of flesh and fabric. It was a sound that filled me with unease, a constant reminder that our child was something different, something that didn't belong in this world. The emotional toll on Julie was immense. She tried to put on a brave face, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she would absent-mindedly rub her belly as if trying to connect with the life, or whatever it was, growing inside her. There were moments when she would break down, her voice trembling as she confessed her fears to me. "What if it hurts me? What if it's dangerous?" she would ask, her voice barely above a whisper. I never had an answer for her, because deep down, I was just as scared. We were both haunted by the knowledge that this wasn't a normal pregnancy, that the baby, our baby, was something that defied all logic and understanding. The strain on our relationship was palpable. We fought more often, the tension between us bubbling over in arguments about things that didn't really matter. I was angry, not at Julie, but at the situation, at the unfairness of it all. Why us? Why did this have to happen to us? Julie's family and friends noticed the changes too, but we couldn't tell them the truth. How could we? What would we even say? The few times they asked about the pregnancy, Julie and I had to be careful with our answers, giving vague responses and deflecting questions. We couldn't let anyone know what was really happening. The fear of being exposed, of becoming some kind of freak show or science experiment, loomed over us like a dark shadow. We knew that if anyone found out, it could mean the end of any semblance of a normal life for us, and for our child. To maintain the secrecy, we had to make sacrifices. Julie started avoiding her family, making up excuses about work or feeling too sick to visit. She told them she was taking a vacation to Europe, photoshopping herself into vacation pictures to keep up the ruse. It was a lie that weighed heavily on her, but it was the only way to protect ourselves from the prying eyes and inevitable questions. I felt the weight of the secret too. Marcus, our friend from high school, still had no idea about the pregnancy, and I couldn't bring myself to tell him. I knew it would raise too many questions, questions I didn't have the answers to. We'd all been close for years, but this was something I couldn't share, not with him or anyone else. The guilt of keeping such a monumental secret from him gnawed at me, but the fear of what might happen if he knew kept me silent. As Julie's due date approached, the fear and anxiety reached a fever pitch. Every day brought us closer to an unknown and terrifying reality. I couldn't help but imagine the worst-case scenarios, what would happen during the birth, what the baby would look like, what it would be capable of. The nightmares that plagued me were filled with images of something monstrous emerging from Julie, something that would destroy us both. Julie tried to stay hopeful, to convince herself, and me, that everything would be okay, that we could handle whatever came our way. But I could see the cracks in her facade, the moments when the fear was too much for her to bear. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be all right, but I couldn't lie to her. I didn't know what would happen, and that uncertainty was the hardest part of all. The secrecy took a toll on our mental health as well. Living in constant fear, unable to talk to anyone about what we were going through, isolated us from the world. We were both consumed by the pregnancy, by the knowledge that what was growing inside Julie was beyond our comprehension. The pressure of keeping it all hidden, of pretending that everything was normal, was suffocating. We were alone, trapped in a nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. But even in the darkest moments, there was a strange sense of responsibility that kept us going. This was our child, no matter what it was made of, and we were the only ones who could protect it. Julie, especially, was determined to see the pregnancy through, to bring our child into the world, no matter how terrifying the prospect was. She had made up her mind, and I couldn't abandon her, no matter how scared I was. We clung to each other, trying to find some semblance of comfort in our shared fear. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when we could almost pretend that everything was normal, that we were just another couple, excitedly preparing for the arrival of their baby. But those moments never lasted long, the reality of our situation always creeping back in to remind us that our lives were anything but ordinary. As the months wore on, the strain became almost unbearable. Julie's belly was now fully swollen, the mechanical movements inside more pronounced than ever. The ticking and whirring had become a constant background noise, a reminder of the alien nature of our child. I found myself lying awake at night, listening to the strange sounds coming from Julie's body, my mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. We were scared, confused, and overwhelmed by the weight of the secret we were carrying. But through it all, there was a thread of determination that kept us moving forward. We didn't know what the future held, but we were in it together, bound by our love for each other and the strange, mechanical life that was about to enter the world. In the end, all we could do was wait and hope that we had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The tension between Julie, Marcus, and me began to build almost as soon as we realized the truth about Julie's pregnancy. What had once been an easy, natural friendship, built over years of shared experiences and mutual trust, started to buckle under the weight of the secrets we were forced to keep. The closeness we had all cherished since high school, the kind of bond that seemed unbreakable, began to fray, slowly but surely, as the reality of our situation took hold. It all started with the little things. The inside jokes that used to make us laugh until we cried no longer had the same effect. Conversations that had once flowed effortlessly now felt stilted, awkward, as if we were all tiptoeing around some invisible barrier. I found myself constantly on guard, afraid that Marcus would notice something was off, that he would start asking questions we couldn't answer. Julie, too, was quieter, more withdrawn when Marcus was around, and it didn't take long for him to pick up on the change in her demeanor. At first, Marcus didn't seem to suspect anything serious. He probably thought we were just going through a rough patch, maybe a minor disagreement or the usual ups and downs of life. But as Julie's pregnancy progressed, it became harder to hide the truth from him. She was getting more tired, more stressed, and it showed. Her belly, too, was starting to become more noticeable, and despite our best efforts to keep her out of sight, Marcus wasn't stupid, he knew something was up. We made excuses, of course. Julie was busy with work, she was dealing with some personal issues, she just needed some space. But the more we distanced ourselves from Marcus, the more strained our friendship became. He would call and text, asking if everything was okay, if there was anything he could do to help. I hated lying to him, hated the way I had to brush off his concerns with vague reassurances that everything was fine, even when it was clear that nothing was fine at all. The lies piled up, each one more flimsy than the last, and it wasn't long before Marcus started to push back. He would ask more pointed questions, trying to get to the bottom of what was really going on. "Is something wrong between you two?" he would ask, his voice full of concern. "Why won't you talk to me? You know you can trust me, right?" Every time, I would dodge the question, feeling the guilt gnawing at me as I deflected with half-truths and excuses. But the worst of it was how it affected Julie. She and Marcus had always been close, closer than I sometimes felt comfortable with, even before all of this. They had a history that went back even further than ours, and there had always been an unspoken understanding between the three of us that their bond was special. But now, with the secret of the pregnancy hanging over us like a dark cloud, that bond was starting to break down. Julie could barely look Marcus in the eye when we were all together. I could see the pain it caused her to keep him at arm's length, the way her shoulders would tense whenever he tried to reach out to her. Marcus noticed too, of course. He wasn't the type to let things slide when it came to the people he cared about, and the more Julie pulled away, the more frustrated and hurt he became. He started showing up unannounced, trying to catch us off guard, as if he could sense that something was being kept from him. One evening, after Marcus had dropped by unexpectedly and Julie had once again made an excuse to leave early, he finally confronted me. We were sitting on the porch, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. Marcus turned to me, his face serious, and said, "What the hell is going on with you two? You're acting like strangers. I know something's wrong, so just tell me. I'm your friend, for God's sake." I remember feeling a surge of panic, my mind racing as I tried to come up with something, anything, to explain the situation without revealing the truth. But there was nothing I could say that would satisfy him. Marcus was too perceptive, too determined to get to the bottom of things. And in that moment, I realized that our friendship was teetering on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move could send it crashing down. I told Marcus that Julie and I were dealing with some personal issues, that it was complicated, and that we just needed some space to figure things out. But it was clear from the look on his face that he wasn't buying it. He pressed me for more details, asking if it was something he had done, if there was something between us that we hadn't dealt with. His questions cut deep, not because they were true, but because I could see the hurt and confusion in his eyes, the realization that he was being shut out of something important. The more Marcus pushed, the more I retreated. I could feel the anger and frustration building inside me, but I couldn't let it out, couldn't let him see just how close I was to breaking. Instead, I just kept repeating the same empty reassurances, hoping that he would back off, that he would stop asking questions. But Marcus wasn't the type to let things go, and I knew that he wouldn't stop until he got answers. Our friendship began to unravel in those moments, the trust we had built over the years eroding under the weight of the lies we were forced to tell. The more we hid from Marcus, the more distant he became, until there was a wall between us that seemed impossible to break through. I missed the easy camaraderie we used to share, the way we could talk about anything and everything without fear of judgment. But that connection was gone now, replaced by a growing sense of mistrust and resentment. Julie and I fought more often during this time, the stress of keeping the secret from Marcus taking its toll on both of us. She blamed herself for the distance between us and Marcus, feeling guilty for the strain her pregnancy was putting on our friendship. I tried to reassure her that it wasn't her fault, that we were doing what we had to do to protect ourselves and our child, but it was clear that the guilt was eating away at her. She missed Marcus, missed the closeness they once shared, and it broke my heart to see her struggling with the decision to keep him in the dark. But we had no choice. The secret of Julie's pregnancy was too dangerous, too strange to share with anyone, even someone as close to us as Marcus. The fear of what would happen if the truth got out was always there, lurking in the back of our minds, driving us to keep up the charade no matter the cost. We couldn't risk Marcus finding out, couldn't risk him telling others, couldn't risk the consequences of exposing our situation to the world. As the weeks turned into months, the rift between us and Marcus only deepened. He stopped coming around as often, stopped calling as much, and when we did see him, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. The easy laughter, the shared memories, the sense of being a part of something special, it was all slipping away, lost in the fog of secrets and lies. Julie and I were in this together, but the price we paid was the loss of a friendship that had once meant everything to us. The weight of that loss was heavy, a constant reminder of the sacrifice we were making to protect our child. And as much as we tried to hold on to the remnants of what we once had with Marcus, it was clear that things would never be the same again. The bond that had once held us together was unraveling, thread by thread, until there was little left but the memory of what we used to be. And in the end, all we could do was hope that, somehow, we could find a way to repair the damage once the truth finally came to light. But deep down, I knew that the secrets we were keeping had changed everything, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The day of Julie's delivery was one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. From the moment we walked into the hospital, the air was thick with tension, the kind that you could almost reach out and touch. The doctors and nurses tried their best to maintain a veneer of professionalism, but it was clear that they were just as scared as we were. They knew that what was about to happen wasn't something any of them had been trained for, something that went far beyond the boundaries of medical science. Julie had been calm that morning, or at least she pretended to be. She had always been stronger than me in that way, able to put on a brave face even when the world was crumbling around her. But as we walked through the sterile, white corridors of the hospital, I could see the fear creeping into her eyes, the way her hand tightened around mine as if seeking reassurance that everything would be okay. I squeezed her hand back, trying to steady the tremor in my own, but the truth was, I was terrified. The hospital staff had prepared a special room for us, away from the general maternity ward, likely to keep the curious and the concerned from seeing or hearing anything they shouldn't. They had tried to make it as comfortable as possible, with warm lighting and soft colors, but the room felt cold, sterile, like a place where something wrong was about to happen. I could see it in the eyes of the nurses as they hurried about, their faces pale and tense beneath their masks. They had never seen anything like this before, and neither had we. The head doctor, a stern-looking woman who had flown in from out of state specifically for Julie's delivery, greeted us with a nod, but there was no warmth in her expression. Her eyes were sharp, focused, as if she were bracing herself for the worst. She had reviewed all the tests, the ultrasounds, the MRIs, but nothing could have truly prepared her, or any of us, for what was about to happen. Julie was settled into the bed, her face pale but resolute. I sat beside her, holding her hand, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to push back the rising tide of fear. I didn't know what to expect, none of us did. The baby growing inside her was something beyond human, something that shouldn't have existed. The uncertainty of what would happen during the birth was almost unbearable. The room was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of a bustling hospital were muffled, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The doctors and nurses moved with a nervous efficiency, preparing the equipment, checking the monitors, but the air was heavy with a sense of impending doom. It was like standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that the ground could give way at any moment. Julie was trying to stay strong, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her grip on my hand tightened with each contraction. She had opted out of nitrous oxide, fearing it might cause birth defects in the baby, even though we knew the baby wasn't human. Instead, she was on a cocktail of medications that kept her lucid but dulled the edge of the pain. I dabbed at her forehead with a napkin, trying to be useful, trying to do anything to ease her suffering, but I felt helpless, like I was watching her walk into a storm without any way to protect her. The doctors whispered to each other in hushed tones, their voices tense as they discussed the best course of action. There were no precedents for this, no textbooks or case studies to guide them. They were flying blind, just as we were, and the fear in their eyes mirrored my own. The first real sign that something was wrong came when one of the nurses, a young man who couldn't have been much older than us, handed me more napkins. His hand shook as he passed them to me, his eyes wide with terror. He knew what we were about to face, and the fear in his expression made my stomach churn. I turned back to Julie, trying to put on a brave face, but she saw right through me. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile I was used to seeing. It was tinged with desperation, with the knowledge that we were stepping into the unknown, and there was no turning back. As the contractions grew stronger, Julie's heart rate spiked, the monitors beeping frantically in response. The doctors moved in closer, their faces masked, but their eyes betraying their anxiety. One of them, the head doctor, leaned in to guide Julie through the breathing exercises, her voice calm but strained. "In through your nose, out through your mouth," she instructed, her hand steady as she monitored the situation. But there was a tremor in her voice that she couldn't hide, a tremor that only heightened the fear coursing through me. There was no heart rate for the baby on the monitors, just a series of mechanical clicks and whirs, sounds that had no place in a delivery room. The noise was faint, almost like the hum of a distant machine, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I had been afraid that the baby would be rusted or corroded, that it would be more machined than anything else, and those fears were rapidly becoming reality. I could see it in the doctors' faces, they had no idea what was about to emerge. Julie's breathing grew ragged as the pain intensified, her body racked with contractions. I held her hand tightly, whispering words of encouragement, trying to keep her grounded, but I could feel her slipping away, retreating into herself as the fear and pain overwhelmed her. She was scared, terrified, even, but she was also determined. She had made up her mind months ago that we would see this through, no matter what, and I was there to support her, even as my own fears threatened to consume me. Then it happened. The doctor positioned between Julie's legs called out that the baby was crowning, but before she could finish, she turned away abruptly, her face pale beneath her mask. She gagged, then ran to the side of the room and threw up into a bedpan. The sight of a seasoned medical professional losing her composure like that sent a wave of dread crashing over me. Whatever she had seen was enough to make her physically ill, and that only made the terror inside me grow. Another doctor stepped in to take her place, but I could see the fear in her eyes as well. She made a cradle of her arms, ready to catch whatever was coming out of Julie, but her movements were stiff, uncertain. I wanted to look away, to shield myself from what was happening, but I couldn't. I had to be there for Julie, no matter how horrifying this was. Finally, the baby began to emerge, and my worst fears were realized. The first thing I saw was its head, slick with amniotic fluid but unmistakably mechanical. It looked like a doll's head, with rigid features and a shiny surface that reflected the harsh overhead lights. The rest of the baby followed, its body unnaturally stiff, its limbs jerking and twitching in ways that no human baby should. Instead of an umbilical cord, there was a metal cord, notched and ridged like something out of a factory. It wasn't flesh, but metal, and it clanged softly as the doctors pulled it out. They had to use tools, bone saws, grinders, to detach the baby from the cord, and as they did, strange, oily fluids oozed out, staining the sterile white sheets with dark, inhuman colors. The sounds of metal against metal, of wires being cut and gears grinding, filled the room, drowning out the frantic beeping of the monitors. The baby didn't cry, not at first. It just lay there, twitching, its eyes closed as if trying to process its new surroundings. When it did finally make a sound, it was a high-pitched, mechanical scream that sent everyone in the room reeling. The nurses and doctors covered their ears, their faces contorted in pain as the sound pierced through the air. I instinctively covered my ears as well, but I quickly realized that Julie wasn't. She was too exhausted, too overwhelmed to protect herself from the noise, so I did my best to shield her, pressing my hands over her ears as the baby's scream echoed in my head. The baby's scream eventually shifted, cycling through different noises, like a machine trying to find the right setting. It went from static to garbled tones, before finally settling on a sound that resembled an ordinary baby's cry. But even then, it was wrong. There was no warmth, no life in it. It was a cry that mimicked humanity but lacked any true emotion, a hollow imitation of what a real baby should be. When the nurse finally lifted the baby, Julie and I got our first full look at it. Its head clicked and whirred as it swiveled to take in the room, its plastic eyes blinking in mechanical rhythm. Its face was expressionless, its mouth opening and closing in jerky, unnatural movements. It was covered in plastic, with what looked like wet yarn for hair, and as it turned its face towards us, its eyes seemed to lock onto mine, sending a chill through my entire body. The nurse held the baby awkwardly, as if she were afraid it might explode at any moment, and I felt a surge of protectiveness rise up inside me. Despite everything, despite the fear, the horror, the sheer wrongness of what I was looking at, this was our child. Julie had carried it for 9 months, had gone through all the pain and suffering of childbirth, and now it was here. Whatever it was, however strange and terrifying, it was ours. Julie reached out, her voice trembling as she said, "Ruby, bring Ruby here." I took the baby from the nurse as gently as I could, feeling the cold, hard plastic beneath its synthetic skin. It was so light, so fragile, and yet I could feel the complexity of the machinery inside it, the way the gears and wires shifted with every movement. I looked down into its eyes, and something inside me broke, something that had been holding back all the fear, all the confusion, all the love that I hadn't allowed myself to feel. I brought the baby over to Julie, placing it in her arms. She looked down at it, her eyes brimming with tears, and I could see the love and fear battling within her. This was our daughter, Ruby, even if she wasn't like any other child. Julie had made the decision to keep her, and I had promised to stand by her side, no matter what. And now, as I watched mother and daughter gaze at each other, I knew that promise was more important than ever. The room was filled with a heavy silence as the doctors and nurses looked on, their expressions a mix of awe and horror. But in that moment, it was just the three of us, Julie, Ruby, and me, trying to make sense of the world that had been thrust upon us. As I stood there, watching Julie cradle Ruby in her arms, I felt the tears start to flow. I was crying, not just from fear, but from a deep, overwhelming sense of responsibility and love. This was our family now, and no matter how strange or terrifying it was, we would face it together. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges that we couldn't even begin to imagine. But as I held Julie's hand and looked down at Ruby, I knew that we would do whatever it took to protect her, to give her the life she deserved, even if that life was unlike anything we had ever expected. Ruby's birth was like nothing I could have ever imagined, a surreal blend of terror, awe, and disbelief that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. From the moment I first saw her, it was clear that she was unlike any other child, an animatronic being that defied all logic and understanding. The experience of bringing her into the world was both disturbing and strangely profound, a moment that would stay with me forever. It began with the first glimpse of her head, emerging from Julie's body slick with amniotic fluid. I was standing beside Julie, holding her hand, when the doctor suddenly froze, her eyes wide with shock. I followed her gaze and saw it, a small, round head that was too smooth, too shiny to be flesh. It glistened under the harsh lights of the delivery room, its surface reflecting the sterile environment in a way that human skin never could. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't the soft, warm head of a newborn baby, it was something else entirely. The head was made of some kind of plastic or metal, its surface unnaturally smooth, like the polished casing of a machine. There were no wisps of hair, no delicate features, just a hard, unyielding surface that clicked and whirred as it moved. The doctor hesitated, her hands trembling as she carefully guided the rest of Ruby's body out. Julie was panting, her face contorted in pain and fear, but I couldn't take my eyes off the sight before me. The rest of Ruby's form followed, stiff and mechanical, her limbs jerking in short, unnatural movements. It was as if she were being assembled right before our eyes, her body coming together piece by piece in a series of precise, robotic motions. Then came the umbilical cord, or what should have been an umbilical cord. Instead of the fleshy, pulsating lifeline that connects mother and child, what emerged was a notched metal cord, rigid and unyielding, like something you'd find in a machine shop rather than a delivery room. The cord clanged softly as it unfurled, its metallic surface gleaming under the lights. It wasn't a single, smooth piece of metal, it was segmented, almost like the links of a chain, each segment connected by tiny, intricate joints that allowed it to bend and twist as it moved. The doctors exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do. This was something they had never encountered before, something that went beyond the boundaries of medical science. One of them reached for a bone saw, her hands shaking as she prepared to cut the cord. I watched in stunned silence as they worked, the saw buzzing as it sliced through the metal with a screech that set my teeth on edge. The sound was jarring, out of place in a setting that was supposed to be filled with the soft cries of a newborn. As the saw cut through the cord, a strange, oily fluid oozed out, dark and viscous, staining the sheets beneath Julie. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. It was so unlike the lifeblood that should have been flowing through the umbilical cord, so cold and mechanical. The doctors continued their work, using a grinder to detach the remaining metal from Ruby's body. Sparks flew as the tool made contact with the metal, filling the room with the acrid smell of burning metal. When the cord was finally severed, the doctors gently lifted Ruby into the air, holding her up for Julie and me to see. My breath caught in my throat as I got my first full look at her. She was small, like any newborn, but that's where the similarities ended. Her skin, if you could even call it that, was made of a smooth, translucent plastic that covered the intricate network of wires and gears beneath. Her limbs were jointed like a doll's, moving with a stiffness that was almost painful to watch. Her face was the most unsettling part of all. It was a blank, expressionless mask, with features that were almost human but not quite. Her eyes were dark, glossy orbs that seemed to click as they moved, tracking the faces of the doctors and nurses as they passed her from one to the other. Her mouth opened and closed with a soft, mechanical whir, but no sound came out, just the empty, hollow motions of something trying to imitate life. For a moment, I was paralyzed by fear. This was our child, our Ruby, but she was so different, so alien, that I didn't know how to react. My mind was racing, struggling to reconcile the sight before me with the idea of parenthood I had always carried. This wasn't the baby I had imagined, the one Julie and I had talked about late at night, dreaming of the future. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist, and yet, here she was. But then, as I stared down at Ruby, something shifted inside me. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else, a sense of awe, of wonder at the sheer impossibility of it all. Ruby was unlike any other child, yes, but she was also ours. Julie had carried her for 9 long months, had gone through all the pain and fear of childbirth, and now, in this strange, surreal moment, she was here with us. I reached out, hesitantly at first, and touched her tiny hand. The plastic was cool and smooth under my fingers, but as I held her hand in mine, I felt something shift, a faint click as her fingers curled around mine in a mechanical grip. It was a small, tentative movement, but it sent a jolt of emotion through me, a realization that this was real, this was our daughter. The nurse almost dropped Ruby as she passed her to me, her hand shaking so badly that I had to step in and take Ruby from her. As I held her in my arms for the first time, the reality of the situation hit me like a tidal wave. She was light, almost too light, and I could feel the hard edges of the machinery beneath her synthetic skin. But she was whole, complete, and despite everything, she was beautiful in her own strange way. I looked down into her eyes, those dark, glossy orbs that whirred and clicked as they focused on me. For a moment, it felt like the room fell away, like it was just the two of us in the world, connected in a way that went beyond blood or biology. She was ours, a part of us, and in that moment, I knew that nothing else mattered. "Ruby," Julie whispered from the bed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Bring Ruby here." I carefully brought Ruby over to Julie, laying her gently in her arms. Julie looked down at our daughter, her eyes filling with tears as she took in the sight of her. I could see the mix of emotions playing across her face, the fear, the uncertainty, but also the love, the fierce, protective love of a mother for her child. As Ruby lay in Julie's arms, her head clicked and swiveled, her eyes locking onto Julie's face. She made a soft, mechanical sound, almost like a whimper, and for a moment, it felt like she was trying to communicate, to connect with us in her own way. Julie began to weep, her tears falling onto Ruby's plastic skin, and I found myself crying too, overcome by the intensity of the moment. This wasn't the birth we had imagined, the life we had expected, but it was ours. Ruby was ours, and as I looked at her, I felt a deep, unshakable bond forming between us. It didn't matter that she was different, that she wasn't made of flesh and blood. She was our child, our daughter, and we would love her no matter what. The doctors and nurses watched us with a mix of awe and horror, but in that moment, they didn't matter. All that mattered was the three of us, Julie, Ruby, and me, together in this strange, new world we had found ourselves in. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, but it was tempered by a deep, abiding sense of love, of responsibility for this tiny, mechanical being that had been entrusted to us. As Ruby lay in Julie's arms, her mechanical movements slowing as she began to mimic sleep, I reached out and gently touched her cheek. Her skin was cool, unyielding, but as I stroked her face, I felt a warmth spread through me, a warmth that told me that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together. Ruby was our child, and we would protect her, love her, and do everything we could to give her the life she deserved. In that moment, I knew that we had crossed the threshold, that our lives had changed forever. But as I looked at Ruby, her tiny form nestled in Julie's arms, I felt a sense of peace, of acceptance. This was our family now, and no matter how strange or terrifying it was, we would face it together. The days following Ruby's birth were some of the most challenging and surreal of our lives. From the moment we brought her home from the hospital, it became clear that caring for an animatronic child was going to be an experience unlike anything we had ever anticipated. The usual joys and challenges of parenthood were overshadowed by the strangeness of Ruby's existence, her mechanical nature introducing a host of questions and uncertainties that left us constantly on edge. From the outside, our rented house seemed like any other, a cozy, safe space where new parents could bring home their baby and begin their life as a family. But inside, it was a different story. Ruby's presence transformed our home into a place of constant tension, where every movement, every sound she made was a reminder that she wasn't like other babies. The first night was the hardest. After the chaos of the delivery and the overwhelming emotions that had followed, we were both exhausted, but sleep was impossible. Ruby didn't cry like a normal baby. Instead, she would emit a series of mechanical whirs and clicks, as if her internal systems were recalibrating themselves. The sound filled the quiet of the night, echoing through the house and setting my nerves on edge. It was a constant reminder that our child was something entirely different, something that didn't belong in the world of flesh and blood. Julie and I took turns staying awake, watching over Ruby as she lay in her crib. Her tiny body would twitch and jerk sporadically, her limbs moving in stiff, unnatural motions that made it clear she wasn't asleep in the conventional sense. Her eyes, those dark, glossy orbs, would occasionally roll beneath her eyelids, as if she were scanning her surroundings even while her body mimicked rest. It was unsettling, to say the least, and I found myself constantly hovering over her crib, unsure of what to do, afraid that she might malfunction or break down at any moment. One of the first challenges we faced was figuring out how to care for Ruby's physical needs, if she even had any. She didn't need to eat or drink, which left us at a loss. We had stocked up on baby formula, bottles, and all the usual supplies, but they sat unused on the kitchen counter, a stark reminder that Ruby didn't fit into the normal routines of parenthood. We tried offering her a bottle, just to see how she would react, but she simply stared at it, her mouth twitching slightly as if trying to understand its purpose. When we held it to her lips, there was no response, no instinctive suckling, just the cold, hollow sound of plastic against plastic. Changing her diaper was another perplexing experience. We had prepared for the usual messes, the endless cycle of diapers and wipes, but Ruby didn't seem to need them. Her diaper was always dry, untouched by any of the bodily functions that typically come with infancy. It was both a relief and a source of deep discomfort, relief that we didn't have to deal with the mess, but discomfort at the unnaturalness of it all. We couldn't help but wonder what was going on inside her, what kind of mechanisms were at work beneath her synthetic skin, and whether we should be doing something to maintain them. Ruby's behavior was another source of constant bewilderment. She would lie in her crib for hours, perfectly still except for the occasional twitch or click of her internal machinery. But then, out of nowhere, she would start to mimic crying, a sound that was almost, but not quite, human. It was an eerie, high-pitched wail that set my teeth on edge, a sound that seemed to come from deep within her, as if her systems were struggling to replicate the emotions of a real baby. But no matter how much she cried, there were no tears, no signs of distress, just that hollow, mechanical sound that filled the room with a sense of wrongness. Julie and I quickly realized that Ruby's crying wasn't a response to hunger or discomfort, it was something else entirely, something we couldn't quite understand. We would rush to her crib, trying to soothe her, only to be met with a blank, expressionless face. Her eyes would follow us as we moved around the room, clicking and whirring as they tracked our movements, but there was no real connection, no sign that she recognized us as her parents. It was as if she were trying to imitate the behaviors of a human baby, but without any of the underlying emotions or needs. In those early days, we found ourselves constantly questioning everything we did. Was Ruby in pain? Could she even feel pain? Were her systems functioning correctly, or was she in need of some kind of maintenance that we didn't know how to provide? The doctors had done what they could during the delivery, but they were as clueless as we were when it came to understanding how Ruby's body worked. We had no manual, no guidebook, nothing to tell us how to care for an animatronic child. Every decision we made felt like a shot in the dark, a guess at what might be right or wrong. Our fears only deepened when Ruby began to exhibit behaviors that seemed almost human. One night, as I was reading to her, something we had decided to try in an effort to bond with her, Ruby suddenly played back a passage from the book in my own voice. I had been reading a simple children's story, the kind you would normally read to a newborn, when Ruby interrupted me with a playback of my own words, perfectly mimicked in tone and inflection. It was like hearing a recording of myself, but it came from her, her mouth opening and closing with the mechanical precision of a tape recorder. I was startled, to say the least. For a moment, I didn't know how to react. Should I be proud that she was mimicking me, or should I be terrified that she was capable of such a thing? Was this a sign of intelligence, or was it just another one of her programmed behaviors? I couldn't help but feel a deep unease as I listened to my own voice coming from her tiny, plastic body. It was as if Ruby were trying to communicate with me in the only way she knew how, but the result was something that left me feeling more disconnected than ever. Julie and I tried our best to adapt, to find ways to connect with Ruby despite the strangeness of her existence. We would sit with her for hours, talking to her, reading to her, trying to engage with her in the ways we would with any other child. But no matter what we did, there was always a barrier between us, a sense that we were caring for something that was fundamentally different, something that didn't quite belong in our world. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of our situation began to take its toll on both of us. The fear of the unknown, the constant questions that had no answers, and the sheer strangeness of our new reality all combined to create a sense of isolation that was almost unbearable. We couldn't talk to anyone about what we were going through, not the doctors, not our families, not our friends. The secrecy we had maintained during Julie's pregnancy now felt like a prison, trapping us in a world where we were the only ones who understood just how different our lives had become. But through it all, there was also a growing sense of responsibility, a determination to care for Ruby no matter how strange or difficult it was. She was our child, and despite everything, we loved her. It wasn't the kind of love we had expected to feel. It was more complex, tinged with fear and uncertainty, but it was love nonetheless. We were her parents, and we would do whatever it took to protect her, to help her navigate this world that she had been thrust into. Every day was a learning experience, a step into the unknown as we tried to figure out how to raise a child that was more machine than human. We knew there would be challenges ahead, challenges we couldn't even begin to anticipate, but we faced them together, determined to give Ruby the best life we could. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the fear and uncertainty threatened to overwhelm us, but we held on to each other, finding strength in our shared commitment to our daughter. In the end, raising Ruby was about more than just caring for an animatronic child. It was about accepting the unknown, embracing the strange and the different, and finding a way to love and protect someone who didn't fit into the neat, tidy categories that society had created. It was about redefining what it meant to be a family, and in doing so, we discovered a strength we didn't know we had, a resilience that would carry us through whatever challenges lay ahead. The night Viking Mouse appeared on our lawn was one of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a moment that shattered the fragile sense of security we had managed to build in the weeks since Ruby's birth, a moment that made all our fears and uncertainties come rushing back with a vengeance. I had known, deep down, that something like this might happen, that the strange, unnatural forces that had brought Ruby into our lives were still out there, still connected to us in ways I couldn't fully understand. But knowing it didn't make it any easier to face when the nightmare became reality. It was late, well past midnight, when I first sensed that something was wrong. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that should have been comforting but instead felt suffocating, oppressive. Julie was asleep in the other room with Ruby, her body curled protectively around our daughter, and I was in the living room, dozing fitfully in an armchair. The motion-sensing lights outside the house had been installed as a precaution, a way to give us some semblance of control in a situation that felt increasingly out of our hands. But that night, those lights flickered on, flooding the lawn with harsh, artificial brightness. It was the first time they had been triggered since we moved in, and the sudden glare jolted me awake. I sat up, my heart pounding as I stared at the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe a stray animal, a deer wandering through the yard. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, a deep, gnawing fear took root in my gut, a primal instinct that told me something was out there, something that didn't belong. I got up from the chair, every nerve in my body on edge, and made my way to the window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. At the edge of the light's perimeter, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure, a hulking, monstrous shape that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was tall, much taller than any person, and its form was unmistakably mechanical. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but the reality of it was too much to grasp. It was Viking Mouse, the animatronic creature from the lake, standing on our lawn as if it had simply walked out of my darkest nightmares and into the real world. The sight of it was like a punch to the gut, a reminder that the strange and terrifying events of the past months were far from over, that they were, in fact, just beginning. Viking Mouse was even more horrifying in person than it had been on those cursed VHS tapes. The metal that made up its body was corroded and rusted, patches of fur and fabric hanging in tatters from its frame. Its Viking helmet, with its exaggerated horns, was tarnished and dented, and its face, what was left of it, was a grotesque, twisted mockery of what had once been a cheerful, child-friendly mascot. The eyes were the worst part, bulbous, black orbs that seemed to pulse with a sickly, unnatural light, as if something alive was trapped behind them, trying to break free. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, Viking Mouse began to move. Its joints creaked and groaned as it took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being manipulated by an unseen puppeteer. Its head swiveled from side to side, the horns casting long, jagged shadows across the lawn as it surveyed its surroundings. The sword fused to the nub of its hand, rusted and dull, was raised in my direction, a silent threat that sent a chill down my spine. I knew, in that moment, that Viking Mouse was connected to Ruby. It had to be. There was no other explanation for why it would be here, on our lawn, just weeks after her birth. The lake, the VHS tapes, the mysterious forces that had impregnated Julie, they were all part of the same twisted puzzle, and Viking Mouse was the missing piece that had finally revealed itself. The realization that this creature, this thing, was somehow responsible for Ruby's existence filled me with a terror unlike anything I had ever felt before. I wanted to run, to grab Julie and Ruby and get as far away from that house as possible, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the monstrous figure in the yard. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to do something, but my body refused to obey. The fear was too great, too overwhelming, and it held me in place like a vice. Viking Mouse took another step forward, its footfall heavy and deliberate, the ground seeming to tremble beneath its weight. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air, a harsh, grating noise that made my skin crawl. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my heart hammering in my chest as I realized that this was no dream, no hallucination. Viking Mouse was real, and it was coming for us. In a desperate bid to protect my family, I tore my gaze away from the window and stumbled to the closet where I had stashed a baseball bat. It was a pathetic weapon, nothing compared to the rusted sword in Viking Mouse's hand, but it was all I had. My hand shook as I gripped the bat, my knuckles white with fear, but I knew I had to do something, anything, to keep that thing away from Julie and Ruby. As I opened the front door, the chill night air hit me like a slap to the face, sharpening the fear that gripped my heart. Viking Mouse was still there, its massive form silhouetted against the glow of the motion lights. It turned its head toward me, those horrible eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment I thought I was going to pass out from sheer terror. I took a step forward, raising the bat in what I knew was a futile attempt at defense. The wood felt familiar in my hands, but against the rusted, towering figure before me, it might as well have been a twig. Viking Mouse didn't stop, didn't hesitate, it just kept coming, its steps slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. The closer it got, the more I could see the details that had been obscured by the shadows. The metal of its body was pitted and corroded, riddled with holes where the rust had eaten away at it over the years. Wires and cables hung from its joints, sparking occasionally as they brushed against each other. Its mouth, a gaping hole lined with jagged, broken teeth, opened and closed with a rhythmic clicking sound, as if it were trying to speak but couldn't quite find the words. In that moment, I knew that Viking Mouse was a relic of the past, a twisted remnant of whatever dark forces had created it. But it was more than that, it was a harbinger, a warning that the danger we faced was far from over. The connection to Ruby was undeniable, and as much as I wanted to deny it, to pretend that this was all some horrible mistake, I couldn't. Viking Mouse was here because of her, because of whatever had brought her into our lives, and there was no escaping it. As the distance between us closed, I felt a surge of anger and desperation well up inside me. This thing, this abomination, had no right to invade our lives, to threaten my family. I didn't care how powerful it was, how connected it was to the forces that had given us Ruby, I wasn't going to let it hurt us. I tightened my grip on the bat, ready to swing with everything I had, even though I knew it wouldn't be enough. But just as Viking Mouse reached the edge of the porch, something changed. It stopped, its entire body freezing in place, as if some unseen force had suddenly taken hold of it. The light in its eyes flickered, the sickly glow dimming until it was barely visible. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, without warning, Viking Mouse turned and began to retreat. Its movements were slow, almost reluctant, as if it were being pulled away against its will. The sword lowered, the glowing eyes dimmed further, and with one last, creaking step, it disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the lights. I stood there, bat still raised, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Viking Mouse was gone, but the terror it had brought with it lingered, wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. My legs felt like they were going to give out beneath me, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of it all. The fear that gripped me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the fear of the creature itself, though that was terrifying enough. It was the fear of what it represented, the knowledge that our lives were forever intertwined with forces we couldn't understand or control. Ruby's existence, the lake, the VHS tapes, everything was connected, part of some larger, darker design that I had only begun to glimpse. As I stood on the porch, bat in hand, I realized that this was just the beginning. Viking Mouse had come and gone, but the threat remained, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And as much as I wanted to believe that we could protect Ruby, that we could find a way to keep her safe from whatever horrors were out there, I knew that the road ahead would be long and treacherous. I lowered the bat, my hands shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to wear off. I needed to get back to Julie and Ruby, to make sure they were safe, but the fears that had taken hold of me was hard to shake. I took one last look at the darkness where Viking Mouse had disappeared, a silent vow forming in my mind. No matter what came next, no matter how terrifying the future might be, I would do whatever it took to protect my family, even if it meant facing the nightmares that had followed us out of the lake. The sense of dread that began to settle over us after Viking Mouse's first appearance was a suffocating, all-encompassing weight. It was like a dark cloud that hovered over our lives, always present, always threatening to break open and unleash something far worse than we could imagine. The initial shock of seeing Viking Mouse on our lawn had been terrifying enough, but it was the knowledge that it wasn't a one-time event, that it could, and likely would, happen again, that truly began to erode our sense of safety and stability. In the days that followed, the fear became a constant companion, lurking in every shadow and every unexpected noise. We no longer felt safe in our own home, the place that was supposed to be our refuge, our sanctuary from the outside world. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the windows, sent a jolt of panic through me. I found myself constantly on edge, waiting for the next appearance, the next sign that Viking Mouse had returned, or that something even worse was on its way. Julie tried to stay strong for Ruby's sake, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. The bright, determined woman I had known was slowly being worn down by the fear, her eyes growing more haunted with each passing day. She jumped at the slightest sound, her hand always drifting to Ruby as if to shield her from an unseen threat. We no longer slept through the night. Instead, we took turns keeping watch, one of us always awake, always alert, scanning the darkened yard for any sign of movement. The nights were the worst. The darkness outside felt thick, oppressive, as if it were alive with the same malevolent force that had brought Viking Mouse to our doorstep. The motion-sensing lights became both a comfort and a curse. Comfort because they were our first line of defense, a warning system that might give us enough time to react if something approached. And a curse because every time they flickered on, my heart would seize in my chest, expecting to see that horrible figure standing in the yard once more. And then it happened. Viking Mouse appeared again, its corroded body emerging from the shadows like some ancient, forgotten monster. It was the same as before, tall, menacing, its eyes glowing faintly as it surveyed our home with a slow, deliberate gaze. But this time, it didn't stop at the edge of the yard. It moved closer, inch by inch, until it was standing just a few feet from the porch, its sword raised as if ready to strike. The dread that had been building inside me exploded into full-blown terror. I knew we couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep living in fear of this thing, or whatever else might come out of that cursed lake. The realization that we were no longer safe, that our home had been irrevocably tainted by the presence of Viking Mouse, was a bitter pill to swallow. But it was undeniable. The creature was relentless, and it was only a matter of time before it, or something else, got through our defenses. We tried everything we could think of to protect ourselves. We reinforced the doors and windows, installed more lights, even considered moving to a different house. But deep down, we knew that none of it would truly keep us safe. The lake had marked us, claimed us in some way that we couldn't fully understand, and there was no escaping its influence. Viking Mouse was just the beginning, a harbinger of the horrors that lay ahead. The fear of what else might come out of the lake was a constant presence in our minds. The VHS tapes had shown us glimpses of other creatures, other animatronics that roamed the underwater wasteland, and I couldn't help but wonder if they too would find their way to us. Each night, as I stared out into the darkness, I imagined what else might be lurking in those depths, things far worse than Viking Mouse, things that could tear our lives apart in ways we couldn't even begin to imagine. Julie and I talked about leaving, about getting as far away from the lake as possible, but we both knew that it wouldn't solve the problem. Whatever was happening, it was tied to Ruby, to the strange, unnatural circumstances of her birth, and running wouldn't change that. Wherever we went, the lake would follow us, its dark influence reaching out like tendrils to ensnare us once more. The only option was to stay, to face whatever was coming and hope that we could find a way to protect our family. But the fear never left us. It seeped into every aspect of our lives, poisoning the moments of joy and peace that should have been ours as new parents. The simple act of holding Ruby in our arms, of watching her sleep in her crib, was tainted by the knowledge that at any moment the darkness could return, and we might not be able to stop it. The sense of impending doom was a constant weight on our shoulders, a reminder that our lives were no longer our own. I started to question everything, our decision to keep Ruby, our ability to protect her, even my own sanity. The days blurred together, a fog of fear and uncertainty that left me feeling hollow, disconnected from the world around me. I was constantly exhausted, both physically and mentally, but sleep offered no escape. My dreams were filled with visions of the lake, of Viking Mouse and the other creatures that might be waiting beneath the surface, biding their time until they could rise up and claim us. Julie and I grew more isolated, withdrawing from the outside world in a desperate attempt to shield Ruby from whatever was out there. We stopped answering the phone, stopped seeing friends and family, afraid that they might somehow bring the darkness closer to us. It was just the three of us, trapped in a house that had become a fortress, surrounded by fear and uncertainty. The worst part was not knowing what Viking Mouse wanted. Was it simply there to terrorize us, to remind us of the forces that had brought Ruby into our lives? Or was there something more, some darker purpose that we couldn't yet comprehend? The uncertainty gnawed at me, feeding the fear until it became almost unbearable. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped by an enemy I couldn't fight, an enemy that could strike at any moment and take away everything I held dear. And through it all, Ruby remained the center of our world. She was our daughter, our strange, beautiful child, and we loved her with a fierceness that surprised even us. But that love was tinged with fear, with the knowledge that she was at the heart of whatever was happening, that the darkness was drawn to her in ways we couldn't fully understand. We were her protectors, her guardians, but we were also the ones who had brought her into this world, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing. As the days turned into weeks, the dread became almost unbearable. Viking Mouse continued to appear, its visits growing more frequent, more menacing, as if it were testing our defenses, waiting for the right moment to strike. Each time it appeared, the fear grew stronger, the realization that we were no longer safe becoming more inescapable. Our home, our lives, our very sense of reality had been shattered, and we were left clinging to the hope that somehow we could find a way to survive the nightmare that had taken over our lives. But deep down, I knew that the lake was not done with us, that the horrors it had unleashed were just the beginning. And as much as I wanted to believe that we could protect Ruby, that we could find a way to keep our family safe, the growing sense of dread told me otherwise. The darkness was coming, and there was no escaping it. All we could do was hold on to each other and hope that we had the strength to face whatever came next. The moment I realized we couldn't keep running from the horrors linked to the lake came during one of those suffocatingly quiet nights, when the dread was almost tangible, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Viking Mouse had appeared again that evening, its hulking form materializing out of the darkness like a bad memory refusing to be forgotten. But this time, it stayed longer, lingering just outside the reach of the motion-sensing lights, as if taunting us, daring us to make a move. I watched from the window, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for it to retreat into the shadows as it always did. But it didn't. It stood there, unmoving, its rusted frame catching the faint glow of the porch light. The sickly glow in its eyes seemed to burn into me, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. For the first time, I sensed something different in its presence, an intent, a purpose that hadn't been there before. It was no longer just a mindless creature drawn to our home. It was waiting for something, biding its time. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't going to stop on its own. We couldn't just wait it out, hope that the appearances would dwindle and eventually fade away. The lake and everything connected to it, the VHS tapes, the animatronics, the dark force that had brought Ruby into our lives, weren't just going to let us be. They were coming for us, and sooner or later, they would find a way in. Running, hiding, reinforcing our defenses, it was all just a temporary measure, a band-aid over a wound that was festering beneath the surface. As I stood there, staring into the dark eyes of Viking Mouse, I felt a deep, bone-chilling fear settle into my bones. But alongside that fear, something else began to grow, an anger, a determination that I hadn't felt before. I was tired of being afraid, tired of feeling like a prisoner in my own home. Most of all, I was tired of feeling powerless, like a helpless bystander in a nightmare that was playing out in slow motion. This was my family, Julie, Ruby, and me, and I wasn't going to let this thing, or whatever else was out there, take them from me. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly waiting for the next appearance, the next horror to emerge from the lake. If we kept running, kept hiding, it would never end. The darkness would keep coming, and eventually, it would consume us. I knew then that we had no choice but to confront it, to face whatever was coming head-on, and to do whatever it took to protect our family, no matter the cost. I closed the curtain, blocking out the sight of Viking Mouse, and turned away from the window. My hands were shaking, but my mind was made up. We couldn't run anymore. It was time to take a stand, to prepare ourselves for whatever was coming, and to fight back against the forces that had invaded our lives. That night, after Viking Mouse had finally retreated into the darkness, I sat down with Julie and told her what I had decided. She was exhausted, worn down by the constant fear and sleepless nights, but she listened, her eyes locked onto mine as I laid out my plan. There was no argument, no hesitation. She agreed with me completely. We both knew that we couldn't keep living like this, that something had to change. And if that meant confronting the horrors linked to the lake, then so be it. The first step was to prepare the house, to turn our home into a fortress. We had already reinforced the doors and windows, but now we went further. We added more locks, more security cameras, motion detectors, anything that could give us an early warning if something tried to get in. We even installed heavy blackout curtains on every window, to keep whatever was outside from seeing in and to block out any unwanted glimpses of the nightmarish figures that might appear on the lawn. Next, we armed ourselves. The baseball bat that had once seemed like a pitiful defense now became part of a larger arsenal. I bought a shotgun, along with a supply of ammunition, and kept it loaded and within reach at all times. Julie learned how to use it, her hands trembling slightly as she practiced loading and unloading the shells. We stocked up on knives, pepper spray, anything that could be used as a weapon in a pinch. It felt strange, surreal, to be preparing for a battle that might never come, but it gave us a sense of control, a feeling that we were doing something proactive to protect ourselves and Ruby. We also started researching, trying to find any information we could about the lake, the VHS tapes, and the creatures that had come out of it. We scoured the internet for anything that might give us a clue, some kind of explanation for what was happening. But the deeper we dug, the more questions we uncovered, and the more it became clear that this wasn't something that could be explained by any normal means. Whatever we were dealing with, it was beyond the realm of science or reason. It was something darker, more ancient, something that defied understanding. Despite the lack of answers, we kept going, driven by the need to be prepared for whatever was coming. We started setting traps around the property, tripwires, makeshift alarms, anything that might slow down an intruder or give us a few extra seconds to react. The house became a maze of defenses, a fortress against the unknown. It wasn't much, but it was all we had, and it made us feel like we were doing something to fight back against the darkness. But the hardest part was preparing Ruby. She was still so small, so innocent, completely unaware of the danger that surrounded her. We didn't know how to protect her from the forces that were drawn to her, didn't know what would happen if those forces finally broke through our defenses. But we did what we could. We kept her close, never letting her out of our sight, and tried to shield her from the fears that permeated our lives. We read to her, sang to her, tried to give her a sense of normalcy, even as the world around us crumbled into something unrecognizable. In the quiet moments, when the fear subsided enough for us to catch our breath, Julie and I would sit together, holding Ruby between us, and talk about what we would do if the worst happened. We made contingency plans, escape routes, places we could go if we needed to flee. We talked about how we would protect Ruby, how we would keep her safe no matter what. It was a grim conversation, but it was necessary. We couldn't afford to be caught off guard, not anymore. As the days turned into weeks, the sense of dread never fully went away, but it changed. It became something we could manage, something we could channel into action. We were no longer just reacting to the horrors that came out of the lake, we were preparing for them, readying ourselves for whatever might come. It wasn't about defeating the darkness, it was about surviving it, about holding on to each other and protecting what mattered most. And so we waited, with a strange mix of fear and determination, for the next appearance, the next sign that the lake was still watching us, still reaching out with its dark tendrils. We didn't know what would happen, didn't know if we would be strong enough to face it, but we were ready. We had made our decision, we wouldn't run, we wouldn't hide. We would confront whatever was coming for us. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?